Hi, and welcome to part 4 of why intolerance and extremism happen and what we can do about all the anger and division. I'm Teri Kanefield. Last time, I talked about the founding conditions and how regressives, when they try to push us backward, are trying to push us back to the founding conditions. Now, let's look at how this desire to return to the founding conditions played out with race and race-related laws in the United States. At the start of the Civil War, the South removed its representatives from Congress because they intended to leave the Union. When the war ended and the South lost, Congress refused to readmit the former Confederates until they agreed to a few conditions. Among the conditions was that the former Confederate states must ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. These are known as the Civil War Amendments or the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment ended slavery, or involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime. The 14th Amendment guaranteed, among other things, equal protection and equal rights for all people. The 15th Amendment removed race as a barrier to voting. The important point here is that the former Confederates did not willingly agree to these amendments. These amendments were literally forced on them. For a brief time, after the Civil War, before the South regrouped and regained power, Black Americans enjoyed civil rights. Some Black men were even elected to local offices. Then came the massive pushback. The United States Supreme Court, which was largely sympathetic to the former Confederacy, ruled that racial segregation was legal under the 14th Amendment. I wrote about all this in my biography of Thurgood Marshall. This ruling ushered in the era of legalized racial segregation and widespread voter suppression. The goal was to keep white men in control. Former Confederates also found a way to exploit the exception in the 13th Amendment, which said that forced servitude was constitutional if the person was convicted in court of a crime. Law enforcement at the time was local with minimum restrictions. There was very little restriction on what law enforcement officers could do, so Black men were often charged with crimes and convicted on scant or non-existent evidence by all-white juries. This is essentially the story of To Kill a Mockingbird. Sometimes the police, after arresting a Black man, would beat a confession out of him. Other times they bypassed the judicial process altogether and the Black person was lynched. If convicted in court, many of these men were put into chain gangs and forced to work. Then, in the 1930s, Thurgood Marshall, Charles Hamilton Houston, and their team of NAACP lawyers organized. They spent decades formulating and carrying out a legal strategy to end legalized racial segregation. They also worked to protect voting rights and to secure rights for people accused of crimes. Among their successes is a case called Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which ended legalized segregation in the United States. This decision paved the way for the modern civil rights movement, which in turn made possible the modern women's rights movement. So, for about 200 years, change was gradual. In the 1950s, racial segregation was still legal. There were places in the United States in the 1950s where Black Americans were entirely cut off from white America. Job discrimination meant that Black Americans were largely confined to menial labor. Housing options were limited due to widespread discriminatory practices. Segregated schools meant that Black children often received an inferior education. Then, over a period of about 25 years, beginning with racial segregation being declared unconstitutional, we went through a period of rapid changes. As a result of these changes, we have an entirely new social structure. Gone is the old hierarchy that put white men on top. Now, I'll talk about laws governing women's dependence on men. When the United States was founded, there was a legal doctrine known as coverture. Under this doctrine, a woman had no legal identity apart from her husband. This meant, among other things, that a married woman could not be sued. She could not enter contracts. She could not borrow money. She could not own property in her own name. Then, after the Civil War, came the 14th Amendment, which says, among other things, this: nor shall any state deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. Women read the 14th Amendment, saw the word people, and thought they should be included. One such woman was Myra Bradwell, born in 1831. Myra Bradwell wanted to be a lawyer. She satisfied all the requirements and submitted her application for a law license. The Illinois Supreme Court denied her request because her status as a married woman would prevent her from practicing law. How, for example, could she sign legal agreements with her clients if she needed her husband's permission each time she wanted to enter a contract? She challenged the decision. She took her case to the United States Supreme Court. Her argument was a simple one. The 14th Amendment said that no state may deny any person equal protection of the laws. She was a person. The Illinois law deprived her of equal protection by refusing to allow her to practice law on the basis of her gender. Therefore, the Illinois law violated the Constitution, and she must be allowed a law license. The Supreme Court of the United States ruled against her. This is from Justice Bradley's concurring opinion. That God designed the sexes to occupy different spheres of action and that it belonged to men to make, apply, and execute the laws was regarded as an almost axiomatic truth. He also wrote this: man is, or should be, woman's protector and defender. The natural and proper timidity and delicacy that belongs to the female sex evidently unfits it for many of the occupations of civil life. The paramount destiny and mission of a woman is to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is the law of the Creator. So, because women were prevented from entering most professions and had a limited means of earning a living, most women had to get married. Because divorce was almost impossible to obtain, women were effectively trapped. As Susan B. Anthony put it, woman's sustenance is in the hands of men, and arbitrarily and unjustly he exercises his power over her. For 200 years, change was slow and there were setbacks. Women in the 1950s, for example, had fewer job opportunities than women in the 1940s because with so many men off fighting World War II, women were needed to keep the economy moving. When the men returned from the war and wanted their jobs back, women were expected to return to the home. The 1950s, therefore, were more repressive than the 1940s. Before the 1964 Civil Rights Act, women could be discriminated against in the job market based on their gender. Before 1974, banks and credit card companies could, and often did, refuse credit cards to women, especially married women, unless they had a male cosigner. Then, in 1974, President Gerald Ford signed into law the Equal Credit Opportunity Act, which prohibited banks and credit card companies from discriminating against applicants based on gender or marital status. Even then, discrimination continued due to loopholes. Okay, so from the founding of the nation until the mid-20th century, not much changed for women. They had to marry. They had trouble finding employment because they were expected to be housewives. Before the birth control pill was widely available, the only real option for most women was to marry and have children. Then, during the same brief period of 26 years, everything changed. Remember, Justice Bradley said that men are and should be women's protector. Well, what is it that women need protection from? That brings us to the history of rape and rape laws. Throughout most of Western history, rape was a property crime. An unmarried girl was her father's property. A married woman was her husband's property. If a virgin was raped, the damage was to her father. If she was married, the damage was to her husband. If she wasn't a virgin and wasn't married, there was no crime because the property was already damaged. A man couldn't rape his wife, his own property, and rape of an enslaved woman wasn't a crime. Attempted rape wasn't a crime because there was no property damage. The social hierarchy determined how rape was treated. Black men were often convicted or lynched if accused by a white woman. White men were largely protected from rape prosecutions because, until the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, women were not considered competent to testify in court. If the only witness to the crime was the victim, and that the victim was a woman and the accused was a white man, it was difficult to find any admissible evidence. Obviously, given the nature of the crime, the woman and the perpetrator are often the only people present. Rape laws were generally intended to protect white men from false accusations. They were not intended to protect a woman from attack. Rape was seen as a natural result of human nature. Men were viewed as natural aggressors. This was the idea that, well, boys will be boys. Because rape was seen as human nature, a woman was responsible for guarding the goods. If she was raped, it meant she failed. Her behavior was taken into account. How was she dressed? Was she out alone? Did she scream or call for help? Did she put up enough resistance? Even though most women cannot overpower a male attacker, and generally without sustaining other injuries. Susan Brown Miller, in her 1975 book, Against Our Will, Men, Women, and Rape, sent shockwaves when she argued that rape was not a natural result of human nature. She said it was a means of exerting patriarchal power. She said this: "Rape is the means by which all men keep all women in fear." Essentially, she argued that all men, even those who would never rape a woman, benefited from the fact that women lived in fear of rape because it meant that women needed male protection. It was one more element that made women dependent on men. As late as the 1970s, a defendant in a rape trial could present evidence that the woman had, in the past, engaged in sexual behavior. This was called the sexual history defense, and it was based on these assumptions. 1, she previously failed to guard the goods. 2, the goods were already damaged. 3, she was unchaste or immoral, which meant that her word could not be trusted. It wasn't until the 70s and 80s, under pressure from women's activists, that states enacted what are called rape shield laws. These laws protect victims and prevent their sexual history from being used as a defense. Nonetheless, the unchaste victim exception, based on the idea that if a woman was unchaste, the rape did no damage, survived in some states into the 1990s. Mississippi was the last state to remove the unchaste victim exception in 1998. As with the laws governing racial relations, for most of our history, things didn't change much. Then, beginning with the modern women's rights movement in the 1960s, the changes were rapid. For women who enjoy bodily autonomy, the women's movement ushered in the best of times. For a group that calls itself Incels, it is the worst of times. Incels are an extremist group. This group began as a benign online community in 1997 for people who had difficulty forming romantic relationships. The term, involuntary celibate, was first abbreviated to INVCEL and then became Incel, which is obviously easier to say. The founder of the website went by the name of Alana. After a few years, she became comfortable with her own bisexuality. She then turned the website over to someone who she didn't know very well. Over the next 14 years, the users radicalized into a group of vocal and angry men who resent the fact that women can, and often do, say no. Today, Incel describes men who complain loudly about their frustration that women are not available to them. Many members advocate coercion and rape. Among other things, they believe that women are too sexually selective and use their privilege, they get to decide, for social advancement. They want to undo the changes and go back to the time when women were dependent on men. Rapid changes will always feel to some people like something vital has been lost. In a sense, men have lost something. There's a scene in an 18th century novel by Fanny Burney called Evelina when a young girl goes to her first ball. She doesn't understand the rules of etiquette. A man who she doesn't like asks her to dance. She tells him no. All good. Then another man who she does like asks her to dance, and she says yes. This was a shocking breach of etiquette. For some time afterwards, she suffered embarrassment and humiliation. Her country upbringing was blamed for her bad manners. Basically, she insulted the first man by telling him no and then accepting someone else. Men could go to a dance and not worry about being rejected, at least on the dance floor. Girls like Evelina were carefully guarded. In the old days, it was also considered the prerogative of wealthy men to have access to beautiful women. This goes far back in time. That's what harems are all about, right? This was what Donald Trump was alluding to in the famous Access Hollywood tape when he said, "Yeah, that's her with the gold. I better use some Tic Tacs just in case I start kissing her. I'm automatically attracted to beautiful. I just start kissing them. It's like a magnet. Just kiss. I don't even wait. And when you're a star, they let you do it. You can do anything." A lot of people expected this tape recording to sink Donald Trump's campaign, and they were surprised when it didn't. It seems to me that there were regressives, both men and women, who wanted to return to the old days, who thought what Trump said was fine. The incels probably cheered for him. And now for an amusing aside. Before law school, when I taught college English, I received a memorable course evaluation from an angry student. The student accused me of ruining a perfectly innocent fairy tale because I told the class that Little Red Riding Hood was a rape allegory. I told the class that the story was a warning to girls not to wander off into the woods alone because they might not be so lucky as to be rescued by a good huntsman. I said it was a warning to girls about how they should behave and a reminder that they needed a male protector. The student evidently thought I was just a dirty-minded English instructor, but I stand by the rape allegory interpretation. I mean, for goodness sake, when the big bad wolf attacks Red Riding Hood, he's in Grandma's bed. The wolf is obviously a metaphorical wolf and not a real wolf, because a real wolf can't say, "The better to see you with, my dear." And tell me again the color of the girl's hood. All right, this is a good time to wrap this one up. In the notes, I'll put a link to Sam the Sham singing Little Red Riding Hood. I'll also put a link to the lyrics. Go ahead and listen and see if you agree that Sam the Sham also thought Little Red Riding Hood was a rape allegory and a warning to girls that they need a man to protect them. Next time, I'll pick up with why a democratic form of government that protects individual rights and allows for personal liberty is always difficult. And I'll talk some more about existence pain. Thank you for listening. I hope you'll join me again.